Hi there. My name is Saria, and I'm a part of the team that brings you live from NYPL. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing our program and speakers. We'll be discussing the beloved story collection, The Arabian Nights, and focusing in particular on a brand new, incredible edition called The Annotated Arabian Nights, Tales from 1001 Nights. The book is a gorgeous volume full of rich annotations and beautiful images, and I can't wait for you to learn more about it in just a few minutes. Joining us today to discuss this magnificent new work and examine its terrific legacy are Yasmine Seale, a writer who works across translation, poetry, criticism, and visual art. Yasmine is the translator of this new edition. We're also joined by Paulo Lemos Horta, an associate professor of literature at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and the author of Marvelous Thieves, Secret Authors of the Arabian Nights. Paulo is the editor of the Annotated Arabian Nights. Also joining us is S.A. Chakraborty, also known as Shannon Chakraborty, the author of the internationally best-selling Alibaba trilogy. S.A.'s work has been translated into over a dozen languages and has been nominated for the Hugo, Locus, World Fantasy, Crawford, and Astounding Awards. Lastly, moderating our discussion is Elias Muhanna, who is an associate professor of comparative literature and history at Brown University. Elias has written for numerous publications, including The New Yorker and elsewhere. He is the author of The World in a Book, Al-Nuwari and the Islamic Encyclopedic Tradition, as well as two translations, The Ultimate Ambition in the Arts of Erudition and The Book of Travels. After our panel conversation, we'll be concluding our program with a special reading from the book by actor Marjan Neshat. Marjan was last seen in the off-Broadway show Selling Kabul at Playwrights Horizons and can be seen next in a co-production of the critically acclaimed play English by the Atlantic and Roundabout Theatre Company. Selected images from the book will be displayed during Marjan's reading. The image credits can be found on the NYPL event page where you are viewing this program at nypl.org/live. You can borrow the Annotated Arabian Nights for free with your NYPL library card, or if you don't have a card just yet and you live in New York State, I encourage you to apply for one so that way you can check out the book. We're also selling the book online through the library shop. All proceeds go to benefit the New York Public Library. We'll be sharing the links to get the book in the chat. Those links can also be found on the event page. We have so many exciting programs coming up at Live from NYPL. Next Tuesday, we'll be presenting a conversation with two scholars of constitutional law who will debate our continuing struggle to realize a more perfect union. Next Thursday, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, the authors of two new memoirs share stories of families that were irrevocably reshaped by the Holocaust. And that's just a small sample of the many amazing programs that we have lined up, so we hope you'll tune in again. These programs are made possible thanks to the generosity of folks like you. So please consider supporting the library however you can. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I do have a couple of housekeeping items to share. Firstly, the library values your privacy. So in the spirit of transparency, there are a couple of things that we'd like for you to know. Even though the video and chat are on an nypl.org page, they're hosted by YouTube. So by participating in the chat, you might be sharing data about yourself, which the library does not control. For more details, you can visit our FAQ page, along with Google's privacy policy and the library's privacy policy, which can all be found on the event page. Real-time captions are available for our program. To access those captions, you can click on the closed caption button. Okay, now without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand it over now to Elias Muhanna to moderate our discussion.
Hello, and welcome to a conversation about the new Annotated Arabian Nights, a remarkable volume that I think will go down as a landmark in the long and colorful publication history of this seminal work of Arabic literature. The text has been translated from the Arabic and the French by Yasmine Seale, a gifted translator, poet, and essayist, and has been introduced and edited with extensive notes by Paulo Lemos Horta, both of whom are with us today, as is S.A. Chakraborty, the author of the best-selling Alibaba trilogy. I've been looking forward to this conversation for several weeks, not least because I'm in the midst of teaching the 1001 Nights this year at Brown University, as I do every year, and I've been struck by the way that this new edition and translation of the Nights brings together so much of the material that makes teaching the text so rewarding. That material relates mostly to its reception in Europe, beginning in the 18th century, and its subsequent transformation over the course of the next 300 years into a major work of world literature. The Annotated Arabian Nights is a treasure trove. That's a word that's often used by publicists to hype books, but I think that in this case, it's a fair description of a book that is simply overflowing with paratext, paintings, woodcuts, footnotes, biographies of former translators, interviews with former translators, short stories inspired by the Nights, and a great deal of erudition. To encounter the Nights through this volume is to be introduced not just to all those wonderful stories and characters, Shahrazad, the Three Women of Baghdad, Sinbad, Aladdin, and Alibaba, but also the individuals responsible for transforming these characters into household names. Antoine Galland, Edward Lane, Richard Burton, Walt Disney, and someone who is very dear to my heart, Hanna Diab. Perhaps we could begin by talking about the genesis of the project. How did it come to be? And Paulo, maybe you want to kick things off just by giving us a sense of where this idea came from, why another translation of the 1001 Nights. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elias, and Yasmine and Shannon. It's just a pleasure to be talking to you. I'm such a huge admirer of your work and your writing. So proud of Yasmine's translation for this book. I was asked to do a kind of greatest hits of the Arabian Nights, and I was asked to do this because I had written a book, Marvelous Thieves, Secret Authors of the Arabian Nights, which asked us to take another look at the stories that were contributed in French. Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, Prince Ahmad and the Fairy Banu, The Night Adventures of Harun al-Rashid, The Jealous Sisters, which is the story of this formidable princess, Parizad. All these tales were actually added in French, as Elias and Yasmine and Shannon well know, but it's the broader audience is often surprised to discover that these stories don't have an original in Arabic, like the core Shahrazad stories, like The Merchant and the Genie or The Porter and the Fair Ladies of Baghdad. So the remit that I was given was to put these stories together. And the reason I was asked to do that was that Hanna Diab has emerged, the storyteller who brought these stories to France in the early 1700s and who gave the stories to the French translator, has emerged out of the shadows. For too long, we imagined that perhaps he was a figment of the French translator's imagination, or if he existed, as he seemed to by traces in Galland's diary, that maybe he just gave some outlines or some raw material that the French translator elevated with the 18th century Parisian and Versailles style into literature. And thanks to new scholarship on Hanna Diab, we can now realize that he was a creator and an author and an inventor of these stories in his own right. So that was really the backstory to this enterprise.
I'm gonna ask you to pause right there just for a moment. Mindful of the fact that many of our viewers may not be familiar with the history of the Nights, and I would bet that pretty much everybody watching has heard of Aladdin and has heard of Alibaba and maybe Shahrazad. But could you just give us a kind of a quick sort of catch me up on where this work of literature came from, what its genesis was, how it ended up, finding its way to Europe, and who these individuals are that you mentioned, Galland, Hanna Diab, just to kind of like set the stage for our conversation.
Sure. I mean, the stories, if we refer to these stories as they exist in Arabic, probably the most important things to keep in mind is that the story collection crystallized in the Middle East. They were middle literature, and they spoke with the middle class. They were mercantile stories. So many of the stories, including the frame tale of Shahrazad, probably originated elsewhere, in India, for example, in the case of that particular story. But they were gathered. We have evidence that they crystallized and they acquired their current form in the Middle East, first in Persian, which is where we get the frame tale of Shahrazad and Shahryar and Dunyazad and all these Persian names, and then in Arabic. Unfortunately, we do not have the Persian version of the actual stories. We just have these traces of the existence in Persian. So these stories, which were often, as I say, middle literature stories of wonder, sort of jolted, or some scholars believe they had a they had they enlarged the scope of what could be done in Arabic, and they had a huge influence in popular and Middle Arabic literature. There's a lot of debate as to exactly what their status was for a very long time, both in the Middle East and in Europe and elsewhere. People being very dismissive of the status of the Arabian Nights in the Arab world. And just very, very recently, and we're talking about the last 5, 10, 15 years, scholars in France, Abu Bakr Shahibi's group, other scholars have begun to see that these stories were actually collected in monasteries and mosques. They must have had some value, as this practice of collecting would suggest, as the notes by the monks would suggest in the monasteries, for example. And it's probably, that's why we've sort of settled this idea of middle literature, partly because they were written in Middle Arabic. But we're beginning to be aware of how already in the Arabic speaking world, they were perhaps not just popular and perhaps not as trashy as we imagined for so long.
Could I just jump in here?
Please.
So Yasmine, you had, before launching into this amazing project, you had some exposure to the Nights. You had published a translation of Aladdin, a new translation of Aladdin. And I'm curious, I'd like to take you back to before that publication and to ask what it was, how much familiarity had you had with the Nights? What was your exposure like in terms of, did you know these stories as a child? What drew you to the text as a translator, as somebody who wanted to have another crack at it?
Thank you, Elias, and thank you, Paulo, for that that great overview of the history of this text. A lot of that history is one that I was rather unfamiliar with when Paulo first approached me and commissioned me to translate some of the stories from the Nights. Although I'm part Syrian and I've studied Arabic literature at university, most of my education to that point was in French and in French literature. So my exposure to the Nights was really mainly through its legacy and its influence on French literature. If you study the French novel, the Nights is everywhere. Almost every great epic French novelist was sort of positioning themselves as writing the Nights for the West in some way. So I was more familiar with the story's wake, if you like, their kind of influence, than with these texts themselves. I don't think I'd ever read them before I was asked to translate them. The initial commission was rather contained. I was first commissioned by Paulo to translate only the Galland stories, so the stories that only have a French manuscript. So initially this was just a commission to translate a handful of stories from 18th century French. But a bit like the Nights themselves, this then mushroomed into a much larger multilingual project, which came to include many of the Arabic stories as well.
Interesting. I think that's fitting in the case of this book, and not just from the translation perspective, but also all of the material that accompanies the translation, and this idea of a wake, the wake of a literature, which is actually a phrase that Borges uses when talking about the Nights, is very much on display in the text, in the margins of the text. All the illustrations, the annotations, the little historical connections that sort of accompany the text itself, I think, are reminiscent of this notion of like an enormous wake following this work of literature. Shannon, your work is very much seems to be inspired by, and by your own admission, not just maybe the 1001 Nights, but more broadly the kind of cosmological world of medieval Islamic thought. And I'm curious, how did you come to this world? How did you arrive at the notion that it would make an excellent foundation for pretext for speculative fiction?
Well, it's interesting because even listening to the discussion thus far, we're talking about the origins of the Nights. And if you want to talk, okay, were they popular in the medieval Islamic world? It's very interesting because if you're looking back at a lot of the the travelogues or the books of wonders and marvels and stories of jinn, stories of the Banu Sasan, just true crime annals from Mamluk Cairo, you see so many of these tropes and characters, and quite frankly, poisoning examples and heists, and they're there. So it's very difficult for me as a writer, talking about my sources and inspiration, to even find the dividing line between what is just inspirations from the medieval Islamic world and what ends up becoming part and parcel of the 1001 Nights. Interestingly enough, I often wrestle with this question because it's something that gets said of my work more often than I say it of my work. The 1001 Nights as the idea of the uber fantastical story of Islam, it dominates everything. You almost can't, talk about a speculative Islamic world without saying, oh, you rewrote Aladdin or you did this. We don't talk about the romances. We don't talk about the epics, the satires, any of these earlier works. It's just the Arabian Nights. So I definitely have inspiration from it. So my main character, Nahri, is from Cairo. She was very much meant to be sort of a nod to Delilah the Crafty, who is also, it's not Cairo, it's Baghdad. But in the Nights, it's very much has this Egyptian context. The city of Brass itself is named for one of my favorite stories from the Nights, which is this great sort of almost Indiana Jones-esque explorations, this magical city that ends up being, whether the people inside are dead, they're statues, they're robots. It's this great sort of genre mashup of what is early science fiction and fantasy. And it's just something I don't think we really get from a lot of sort of Western fairy tales, is this wit and warmth and urban world that I more wanted to pull on.
Mm-hmm. It occurs to me as I listen to you that I think we still might have a little bit of hand-holding to do for parts of our audience who are not familiar with the structure of the Nights, who may well be familiar with some of the individual stories, Aladdin, Alibaba, and so on. But let's just talk for a moment, and maybe Yasmine can do this for us, about the narrative conceit of the Nights, about Shahrazad, about Shahryar. What is that story? Maybe you could just kind of like summarize it for our viewers.
Sure. The Nights are less a text than a kind of loose collection of stories. And what holds them together is the conceit, as you put it, the framing story of Shahrazad and Shahryar. The story begins with the tale of two brothers, Shahryar and his brother Shah Zaman, who both discover that they have been betrayed by their wives, who are discovered sleeping with the servants. And both these kings react very badly to this discovery. And we then follow Shahryar in particular, who reacts with a kind of murderous project, which is to eliminate the risk of ever being betrayed again by killing every woman that he sleeps with, having spent one night with her. And he does this until there are almost no women left, at which point Shahrazad, who is the daughter of his political advisor, his vizier, volunteers. She steps forward to end the massacre of the women of her kingdom by marrying the king and by playing for time, by delaying her death. This is the famous conceit of a woman telling stories to save her own life every night. So the work is organized not in chapters, but in nights. The unit is the night. So each night is contains a portion of a story, which crucially doesn't end at the end of that night, but is interrupted, and therefore you have to read the following night to know the end. So it's a kind of cliffhanger, the classic cliffhanger structure.
Yes, exactly. Maybe the original hanger. And whenever I teach this course, my students are always just mesmerized by this figure of this female protagonist who steps forward and kind of says, I got this. I'm going to save humanity. I'm going to save the world. She's a superhero, and she does it with her ingenuity and her creativity. So she's a marvelous figure, a marvelous heroine. And I wonder, I imagine, Yasmine, you've gotten this question. In fact, I think I know that you've gotten this question recently because there was an Economist write-up of the project. And I'm curious to know whether, first of all, The Nights, as far as I know, has never been translated by a woman, or it has been translated by a woman or women because some of them are interviewed in the book. Is that right? Yes. So, but as far as I know, no major English translation has been published with a female translator. And I'm curious whether that is relevant. Was that at all, did that ever weigh on you? Did you ever think about that?
I guess what I would say is that women have been involved in the transmission of these stories forever. So I guess it depends what we mean by translate. Women have been translators of the Nights in the widest sense forever. When it comes to transmitting these stories orally, telling them, whenever I talk to someone and they say their relationship with the Nights often comes from having been told these stories, often by a mother or a grandmother. Mm-hmm. So they've been essential transmitters of the story in that sense. The great publishers of the Nights, Galland's publisher was a widow called Marie Cochard, one of the great sort of businesswomen of the 18th century, to all the women who've performed and rewritten these stories. And I guess what I would say about these stories in English is that many women have rewritten these stories or adapted them or written back to them. So I think there is a whole kind of parallel history of translation by women of the Nights, which is more irreverent, perhaps more critical. So if we take translation to mean the faithful transmission of these stories, then that's one definition of translation. But I think if we widen that a little bit, plenty of women are part of that history. And I suppose then the question is, well, is the Nights a work that invites faithful transmission? At various stages in this project, I have wanted to write back to it or to kind of play with the text or change it rather than to sort of faithfully reproduce it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Borges famously wrote in an essay about the history of translation of the 1001 Nights. He said that Lane translated against Galland and Burton translated against Lane. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with who these individuals are, they're all translators of the Nights. Antoine Galland being the first European translator who produced a French translation, Edward Lane being the first translator into English, unless I'm wrong about that, and then Burton translating another very successful late 19th century translation. And so Borges said, if you look at these three translations, the latter two, it's clear that Lane felt that there was something that needed to be corrected about Galland's translation, and that informed his practice. And Burton thought that there was a lot wrong with Lane's translation. He thought that it was far too polite, that it got rid of all the body bits, all of the steamy bits, and he certainly overcorrected. He put a lot more. He put it all back in and then some. So I'm curious, Yasmine, did you have anything in mind? Did you translate against a particular translation? Was there anything that you wanted to make sure got across that hadn't gotten across before?
I think Borges in that essay calls us a hostile dynasty. All the translators, he says, they've all their secret aim was to annihilate the predecessors, each in their various ways. Galland, as you say, was translating these stories for mainly aristocratic French women. Those were his readers, and he was adapting the text to their tastes and dramatically intervening in some cases to make this Nights into a piece of French literature of its time. It's charming, his text, it's rather prim, it's very concerned with propriety and decorum. Lane, the second man in this dynasty, who's not the first person to translate it into English, but that is one of the better known translations of the 19th century. He has a similar approach. He's also rather censorious, but he intervenes even further. He not only removes everything that he considers to be in bad taste, but he tells us in the notes, there are these detailed notes in Lane's translation where he says things like, "Here I have removed an episode of the most reprehensible sort," or "Here is a line far too coarse for translation." This is Victorian cancel culture, where he's kind of snipping away at anything he finds remotely offensive. And sometimes he removes whole stories on puritanical grounds. I think Borges describes Lane's translation as an encyclopedia of evasion.
Evasion, yeah.
It's so heavily redacted. Burton was a contemporary of Lane's and tried very hard to distinguish himself from Lane in every way in his own translation. Sometimes this was linguistic, when Lane's translation is rather solemn, quite sober. Sometimes it feels almost like reading scripture. He was a great reader of the King James Bible, and his Nights sometimes has that flavor. Burton, on the contrary, his text is a kind of wild collage that's almost unreadable. It's full of words of his own invention or archaic English words that he resuscitated. The style is incredibly flowery and baroque, which is a misrepresentation of the original, which is rather simple. And more than this, Burton adds detail where Lane and Galland often redact and remove and censor. Burton injects the text with his own obsessions and fantasies and prejudices. He adds racist details sometimes that are not in the original. So there are these kind of two poles among the early set of translators, the kind of sanitizing, censorious approach of Galland and Lane, and on the other hand, the kind of wild fantasies of Burton, both of which I think misrepresent the text in various ways. So I wanted to kind of steer clear of either of those. But then there's another set of more recent translations made in the late 20th, early 21st centuries, usually by academics. There are a couple which are widely available and I'm sure are useful to teach with. These are much more straightforward prose versions, which those translators were very aware of the distortions of the early translations, and in a way went in the other direction. They were very careful not to intervene, and they don't attempt very much stylistically. Mm-hmm. They're sort of useful prose accounts of the content of these stories, but they tended to leave out the musical and rhythmic aspects of these stories, which I think are very important to the original. So when I was asked to do this work and I sort of looked at what was available in English of the Nights, I found that there were either these antiquated translations, which were stylish, but often unreliable and sometimes objectionable. And on the other hand, there were these modern translations that were more accurate, but didn't exactly sing. Mm-hmm. And there seemed to be this idea that to produce a good, faithful translation that satisfied scholars, style was something to be a bit suspicious of. And I suppose what I was trying to work against was the idea that you have to choose between being responsible and being stylish, mm-hmm. As if style were this frivolous or optional aspect of a text.
Paulo, do you agree with Yasmine? Did you have other, or could I ask you to be maybe less polite than Yasmine and tell us what you were hoping your Nights would do that other Nights had not done?
Well, I certainly cannot improve on Yasmine's description. I can give a little bit of just background on why a new translation, right?
Yeah.
Actually, if you go into the archives, as I did for Marvelous Thieves, these translations we think exist, they sort of just fall apart in your hands. So it turns out that actually Lane translated very little. It was a partial translation. He shouldn't really be remembered as the first translator. And Burton and Payne may have translated from French and German as well as from Arabic, or perhaps even more from French and German than they did from Arabic. So in a way, I think we are not blessed, despite Borges's Anglophilia and his focus on these adventurers and these imperialists. we're actually not blessed with that many translations of the Arabian Nights. Thank God that we have the chance for Yasmine to redeem this. And I will say, just to give an example, it's in a way easy to pick on Burton, who brought his own racism and sexism in Lane, cut out the female protagonists, who we all find so important to reflect Shahrazad's own predicament in the Arabian Nights. But even more recent translations pose their own problems, right? So I've taught the Arabian Nights like you have, Elias, but I've done it for the last 10 years in the Middle East. But even before I taught it here, and I've taught it both in Abu Dhabi and in Istanbul. And my Arab and my Muslim and my Turkish students always complained that Hadawi, for example, translated genie as demon, which they feel like demonizes the jinn, who of course have free will, who can observe Ramadan, they can be good, as we often see in the stories of the Arabian Nights themselves.
Yeah, they can be
where
adulterous.
a demon would not help out. Sorry?
They can cheat on their wives and, and have a mistress on the side. And yeah.
They can make all sorts of choices. They can also choose to be faithful. And that was the dimension that was missing. So I think that I would say perhaps you're right. I think Yasmine was very diplomatic, but I would say even the recent translations have their own biases and their own problems, not just the Victorians. And originally my hope in the back of my mind, I started with the French stories, but Yasmine had been recommended as somebody who could translate from Arabic as well. So that was always the sort of hidden plan to, once Norton really liked the translations from French, we would also do a sort of a greatest hits core from Arabic as well. So yeah, that I hope maybe that helps give a little bit of a sense of how this came together.
It does. Maybe we could shift a little bit away from the history and to the text itself. And I'm struck by something that Shannon said a little earlier about the fact that we have that the Nights is continuous. The world of the Nights is continuous with the world of Arabic literature or Islamic literatures, Persian and Turkish. Such that anybody who is familiar with that larger world would recognize elements of it in the Nights and not be surprised by their existence. So I'm going to give you maybe a difficult question, Shannon, and I'm curious. Why do you think? What is it about the Nights that has made it such a huge blockbuster success? These other works that you mentioned earlier, the romances and the epics and the collections of maqamas and Arabic literature is a vast tradition, but those works aren't as well known. There may be no work as well known as the 1001 Nights. So would you argue that there's something about the text itself that has led to this kind of resonance that it has across cultures?
I would argue there's lots of different answers for this, but I'll come at it at two parts. One, the stories themselves are really great. They are, we talk about it as fantasy. They are really sort of this pulp fiction, and they appeal somewhat to a common, some occasionally low denominator, but in that these stories of tricksters and magic and madness, that's something that is just incredibly appealing. It can be played with, it can be adapted, and I think, even when I think of the 1001 Nights, I always think of the trickster stories. Trickster stories are probably one of the most human stories our entire globe has. Every culture has them. We all love them. Everybody loves the idea of someone who gets it over the guy in top. So I think a lot of the appeal of this is that there is global. At the same time, I think, and both Yasmine and Paulo can speak better to this, a lot of it is in sort of the, as we say in publishing, the placement and the promotion and the billing. And there's a reason these stories became so popular in the West, and it's largely because that they were pushed. And as much as I enjoy the 1001 Nights, I do often find it problematic that if you think about the Islamic or the Arabic text and story that is most popular is one about despots. It's one in which the frame story itself is incredibly misogynistic. What sort of ideas is that playing into in the West when it likes to think of the East and its associated stories and magic? And I think that's something, as much as we can enjoy these stories, their popularity and why it is they stick when, say, the ballad of, Princess Fatima, who is a warrior and a fighter, that doesn't quite stay. And in some of the satires and things that I think would make that part of the world and that time a little bit more human, a little bit more complex, majestic and noble, those don't quite have the same staying power.
Mm-hmm. Paulo and Yasmine, do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Shannon, and I agree with you. I think there's also another way of thinking about Scheherazade, which also might explain why the conceit of the work has been so appealing to writers. The work doesn't just have popular appeal; it has great writerly appeal, and so many writers have tried to write the 1002nd Night or been sort of obsessed with the kind of conceit of Scheherazade. I think she is also a figure for the writer. She's a kind of authorial figure, and the whole work dramatizes this possibility of the death of the writer, which is no longer being read. That is what death is for a writer, no longer being listened to, being forgotten. And she presents this kind of model for literature, I think, which is to do with remembering previous material and recombining it to make new stories.
I would also say, Elias, that Shannon really has it right, particularly not only in the way she's talking right now, but in the way she introduces magic in The City of Brass and in the first volume of her trilogy. We actually start in the city, right? We start in the sort of in that world, and then the trickster emerges, and from there we end up with the jinn being evoked. And we have to remember our readers for this edition might be surprised. The Arabian Nights are not a series of Aladdins. They are very urban and urbane stories, particularly the stories that come to us from Arabic, like The Porter and the Four Ladies of Baghdad, which is, amazingly translated and rediscovered, I think, in Yasmine's translation. So we have to remember that there was something counterintuitive that happened in Western letters. In the early 1700s, there were not a lot of texts about cobblers or tailors or even merchants as heroes. So it's a very counterintuitive fact of literary history that a lot of the attraction of the Arabian Nights was because they had these sort of like average people. I think Shannon was touching upon this, right? And it was not just the jinn. And a lot of the most popular stories were these stories of tricksters, and the jinn sort of sometimes come into these stories or they're floating around, but they were not necessarily always stories of escape and fantasy. They were often stories that connected with a middle class and a popular audience. In Europe, we see that there are people who are illiterate, that were servants who memorized the stories, who went back to their home cities and hometowns and told these stories. So, and all that happened before 1798 and Napoleon invades Egypt and a whole history of imperialism. Aladdin was already on stage by 1770 and other stories from the Arabian Nights. So I think this sort of average guy, as Shannon was putting it, that's very important. In fact, that a history of why Dickens and George Eliot and the Victorians and all these writers are attracted to the Arabian Nights, and realism. A lot of the most influenced literature in the West, as Yasmine was referring to it, it's almost harder to point out stuff that was not influenced by the Arabian Nights in the 18th and 19th century in European letters, and often realist literature, not just the Gothic, not just romance and romanticism and sci-fi and fantasy, but very realist literature found inspiration in these average men and women who conned their way and found their way in the stories of the Arabian Nights.
Yeah, and I wonder, one thing that I always notice in my students' reactions is that they identify with a lot of the narratives and the characters in the text, and that says a lot. I mean, we're dealing with a text that is, who knows how old it is, but we know it's at least as old as like the 9th century, and they see them. These narratives speak to them, and they illustrate ethical quandaries that resonate today. As Shannon said, that the frame story can be read as deeply misogynistic, but it could also be read, as like enormously empowering and progressive, as my students like to say. I'm reading, going through 100 essays right now on whether or not Scheherazade is a proto-feminist, and half the students think that she is, and half the students think that she isn't. So I think that there's that kind of the ambiguity in the tales helps maybe. Has helped, might explain their popularity in some ways because they can be read in all sorts of different ways. I wanted to ask about, so one of the things that really sets this volume apart, and it would be a shame not to address this, is that it is richly illustrated and annotated. And Paulo, I'm wondering how you envision the reader engaging with these annotations. Do you think that they will unlock some aspect of the work that remains out of sight in earlier editions? What was the vision for this kind of format?
There are certain constraints of doing something for a first-time reader and a general reader, but there are also, I guess, opportunities, right? So the series, the Brothers Grimm, the annotated edition, the annotations are about the story. What make these stories work? Are there, important psychological interpretations of the story? That's how Maria Tatar is able to approach these stories, and that is actually not that common for the Arabian Nights, because of course Lane and Burton and Torrens and others in the past, in the Victorian era, would just went straight to anthropology. And they were actually not thinking, as Shannon said, these are great stories, right? In Washington, the newspaper review that just came out in the Washington Post the other day, it ends in the same way, right? These are fantastic stories. These are great stories, and that's really what I was trying to the extent of my limited powers, to try and shed some light on. And because we forget how well they work as stories, which perhaps explains why so many stories of young women and young men coming of age and adventuring do appeal to young people today. In terms of the illustrations, this is the first non-Western text in the annotated series, and I was desperate to try and balance. Of course, we're going to have some Dulac, and there was some unavoidable French and other European artists who are so brilliant at illuminating the Arabian Nights. But I was really, from the private collections of Oleg Makhzov of Persian woodblock prints, to private collections in Dubai, I was just trying desperately to balance things out and have visual illustrations by artists who were themselves from the Middle East. So that's a lot of the conception that was behind the selection of illustrators for this edition.
Does anybody want to tell us what their favorite story from the Nights is? Yasmine, come on. Is there a story that you maybe either enjoyed translating the most, or struggled the most with, or felt most satisfied with the results?
I often say the story of the porter in response to that question. It's such a satisfying cycle. I feel like it contains everything from realism all the way up to the fantastical. It's dreamlike, and it's also incredibly precise. It has so much real detail on material culture, at the same time as being full of strange fantasy and anxiety.
Do you want to give us a summary of the story for those who don't know it?
It's the story of three women who live together without a man. And this fact prompts a kind of problem. One of the women, the story begins with one of these women out in the market. And so it begins with essentially a long shopping list over several pages. It's a kind of long description of all the different things that she can buy in this market in Baghdad, which is itself wonderful because the list is a combination of things that are very familiar to us and products or dishes that have disappeared. So that list involved doing research into medieval puddings and trying to reconstruct, what these things would have looked like or tasted like, and trying to invent English names for some of these confections. And that cycle of stories also contains. So what happens is that the porter, this woman meets a porter in the market who helps her carry her shopping home, discovers that these three women, whose relationship is kind of ambiguous, live together and are apparently very happy without men, and stays to find out the secret, what is actually going on.
And they're not keen on divulging secrets, least of all to men. Yeah.
They're not. The stories come back to this theme of curiosity being a dangerous thing. And this maybe connects with what we were saying before about the appeal of the Nights in general. Paulo, you mentioned realism and the kind of rise of interest in realism, but I think the Knights are also appeal to a kind of ideas about reason and irrationality. The Knights is constantly trying to integrate, I think, what it is to investigate the world, what it is to be curious about the world as it is, and what it is to escape into a parallel world, a fantasy world. I feel like it provides a kind of model for trying to understand these two sort of aspects of experience, the rational investigating mind and the irrational mind.
Interesting. I mean, another aspect of that story, as far as investigating goes, as I recall, is that it investigates, it puts forward this idea that men and women are fundamentally different creatures. It plays with this idea. It kind of proposes it. Creatures that have their own logics and their own languages. And this is illustrated in a very famous scene where the three women of the house and the porter whom they've invited into the house basically get naked and play a game that, walks the line between sexual play and sexual abuse, where they start, they engage in this process of naming their genitalia, asking each other to name their genitalia. And the man does not know the names of the female genitalia, and the women don't know the name that he has given his member, as it were. And the story seems to be investigating this theme also. Like, are men and women, do they belong to the same species, or do they inhabit different worlds? Which is related to the betrayal at the beginning of the book that launches the king on his murderous rampage. Do you have a sense of where the story comes down, or maybe where the collection comes down on this question of the relationship between men and women?
It's such an interesting question. I wonder if Paulo and Shannon have any ideas about that. I had never thought about this question, whether it offers an answer to that question. I think there is perhaps more indeterminacy in the story than you're suggesting. One of the interesting things about the three women is that they're not named in the text. They're only described in terms of their role.
Yes.
One is the buyer, and one is the owner, and the third is the keeper, because she keeps the door. And the other thing is that they're described in terms of their beauty, but they're described in terms that are then used to describe boys in the story, beautiful young men. One of the lovely aspects of the style in the Knights, which is true of a lot of classical Arabic writing, is the text often breaks into a different sort of register to describe beauty. And often men and women are described in similar terms. The men are often sort of feminized or compared to flowers. But I'll keep thinking about that question.
Yeah, and I hope this will become an excuse for us to hear from Shannon as well, what her favorite story is. I just wanted to add very quickly that Hannah Diab's stories, the stories that were added from his storytelling, right, in French in the early 1700s, include fantastically strong female protagonists like Marjana and Alibaba. In fact, his title was the Finesses of Marjana. It was the French translator who called it Alibaba.
Oh, interesting.
And also the Princess Parizad and Peri Banu. And I really think Yasmine is right. There are other stories in the original Arabic core that also play and, I think, trouble these distinctions between men and women. And we think of Kamal Zaman and the Princess Badur, for example. But it's interesting that Hannah Diab, in his own travelogue, when he was traveling as a young Syrian through Europe, he was fascinated by women receiving the same education as men. And he puts that detail shows up in the story, for example, Parizad, who received the same education as her noble brothers, and who just displays these traits which perhaps are traditionally thought of as masculine. So I like the way that Yasmine was complicating that distinction. And I'm desperate to hear what Shannon's favorite story is.
Go ahead, Shannon. Give it to us.
I mean, I was sitting here going, there are like 10 that came to mind, but I'm going to pick the Sinbad stories. And a lot of this is because I'm working on a medieval maritime retelling right now, and I've been reading them and going through them a lot more often. And I like the Sinbad stories for a lot of reasons. One, since we're speaking to a wider audience, I feel I should clarify, he was not necessarily the sailor or captain. He was a merchant. He had all these grand adventures, but I feel like a lot of Western retellings want to turn him into like this, like Conan the Barbarian figure who's rough and tough, and that is just not Sinbad. But I like these stories because, one, there are traces of earlier stories. I'm a big fan of the history of storytelling, and in a lot of the Sinbad stories, you can get a sense of earlier classical era monsters and stories. There's lots of parallels. There's lots of lore that gets brought in from the very earliest travel stories of India and China, and sort of the sea captain stories. And there's just this great sense of wonder about what it would have been like to sail upon the Indian Ocean and out of the Persian Gulf during this time. But what I like most about the Sinbad stories is he's a messy person. He has about the largest sense of fear of missing out of any character I've ever met in life, which is incredibly relatable. He's not, I mean, in his earlier stories, yes, he's the bright young thing who goes off, but as he gets older, he can't give it up. He just one more time, then he repents to God. I swear I will never do this again. And then it's like, the fifth story of Sinbad.
Yep.
And I find that very human and relatable for people. None of us want to think our time has passed. And also on the idea of reading these stories, to a Muslim audience, it says a very gentle lesson about the idea of repentance, that you can sort of mess up and keep asking for that forgiveness, that I always thought was a very calming lesson and would have been a nice thing to hear, amongst the giant bird stealing antics.
Paulo, do you have a favorite story?
Well, I was trying to draw our attention to some of the Diab stories, which are not just Aladdin and Alibaba, right? So
Yeah.
I do really like, as I say, I like these stories. Sidi Numan in the Night Adventures of Harun al-Rashid is actually the story which the first story that Yasmine translated for this project. And it's this wonderful story, speaking of the story that disrupts gender norms and sort of asks us to question. This man marries a woman who only eats a little grain of rice every day. And he doesn't know why that is. And he follows her to the cemetery, and spoiler, she's sitting with a ghoul in front of a freshly dug grave and feasting on human flesh, right? So I love the fact that the grab bag of genres in the Arabian Nights does allow for horror. That may explain why Guillermo del Toro and others love this story collection. And it may also be a good warning for the buyers of the volume that not everything is Aladdin.
No.
Yeah.
I know people keep saying, "Oh, I'm going to read it to my 5-year-old tonight." I just think, are you sure?
Well,
you cannot escape Aladdin. You just can't.
You can't escape Aladdin, exactly. I'm afraid we are running out of time. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers, panelists, everybody watching. Thank you for tuning in. Let me encourage you to buy the book. It's just a marvelous text. I think that this is going to be airing after the holidays, but you should buy it anyway and give it as a gift. I'm wondering whether I can get away with assigning it to my students next year when I teach the nights again. Will there be a paperback edition?
Well, it's not that expensive.
It's not that expensive, but it's enormous. I don't know if I can make them bring it to class, but
they like them as objects,
Yeah, that's true.
I'm assigning it to my students already. I'm teaching the 1001 Nights now in spring, and we're reading it in this version.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to. Which is okay, because we were actually the text that I've used for the longest time is the Norton critical edition. So Norton won't be losing out, I guess. So thank you again. We leave you now with a short reading from the Annotated Arabian Nights, Tales from 1001 Nights, accompanied by some of the wonderful illustrations and photographs included in the book. Giving our reading is actor Marjan Neshat, who was recently in Playwrights Horizon's acclaimed show, Selling Kabul. Marjan will be reading the opening of The Story of Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. Enjoy.
Hello, my name is Marjan Neshat, and I'll be reading a passage from The Story of Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. Shahrazad, awakened in the night by her sister, told the Sultan the story she had promised him. Majesty, there lives in Persia, at the edge of your Majesty's kingdom, 2 brothers, one named Qasim and the other Alibaba. Their father had left them very little, and neither received more than the other, so their fortunes should have been equal, but chance dealt them different fates. Qasim married a woman who, not long after their union, inherited some land and 2 shops well supplied with goods, and he soon became one of the wealthiest merchants in the city. Alibaba, whose wife was no richer than he was, lived in poverty and kept his family alive by chopping timber in a nearby forest and taking it to market on 3 mules, which were all he owned. One day, Alibaba was in the forest, loading his beasts with the day's wood, when he noticed a cloud of dust rising toward him. Through narrowed eyes, he made out a band of men on horseback charging at full gallop. It occurred to Alibaba, without knowing why, that the riders might be thieves. Abandoning his mules, he thought only of saving himself, and he climbed into a tree at the foot of a rock too craggy to scale. There, concealed by densely crowded branches, he looked out. When the riders reached the crag and dismounted, Alibaba counted 40 men. Watching them, tall, tough, and armed, he guessed that he had been right. These were outlaws who had left neighborhoods and traveled far to plunder. They unbridled their horses, tied them to trees, and fed them from sacks of barley they had brought on their backs. Then they unloaded their bags, which looked so heavy that he thought they must be full of gold and silver. Alibaba watched the most striking man, whom he took to be their captain, make his way through the bushes beneath his tree, and by the rock he heard him say the words, "Open, sesame." A door opened in the rock, and having made his men enter, he followed them, and the door closed behind him. The thieves stayed for some time inside, and Alibaba, fearing that they might burst out again if he tried to leave, was forced to sit patiently in the tree. He was tempted to slip away and ride away on one of the horses, leading another one alongside and chasing his mules ahead of him, but nerves kept him frozen to the bough. At last the door opened. The captain was the first to emerge, and when the 40 thieves were out, he said, "Close, sesame," and the door shut. Every man returned to his horse, bridled it and mounted, and their captain led them off the way they had come. Fearing that some oversight would bring them charging back, Alibaba was slow to climb down from his tree. Long after the men had ridden out of sight, he descended, and curious to try the effect of the captain's words, he went looking for the door behind the bushes. When he reached it, he said, "Open, sesame," and the door was thrown wide. He expected darkness, but this was a vast, bright place lit by an opening in the ceiling, which human hands had hollowed into a vault. He saw piles of food, bales of rich merchandise, silk and brocade, fine carpets, and enormous leather sacks spilling gold and silver. It seemed to him that centuries of thieves had used this as their lair. Alibaba entered the cave, and the door closed behind him, but he knew its secret and pressed on untroubled. He did not look at the silver, but collected as much gold as he thought his 3 mules could carry. Then he loaded them with the loot, which he hid under logs, and with the words, "Close, sesame," he shut the door and returned to the city. At home, Alibaba drove his mules into the barn, left the logs there, then took the bags indoors to his wife and laid them out on the sofa. Believing she had stolen them, she opened her mouth to protest, but Alibaba cut her off. "I am no thief," he said, "unless it is theft to steal from thieves. See how lucky I have been." He emptied the bags before her, and after relating his adventure, warned her to keep the secret. His wife, cured of her disapproval, fell on the gold to count it. "We have no time to lose," said Alibaba. "I will dig a hole and bury it." "We would be wise to measure it," replied his wife. "I will go and borrow a scale from a neighbor while you dig." "Do as you please," he said, "but keep the secret." She went to see her brother-in-law Qasim, who lived nearby. He was not home, so she asked his wife if she might quickly borrow a measure. "Large or small?" said her sister-in-law. "Small," came the answer. "Of course," said Qasim's wife. "One moment." She went to fetch one, but knowing Alibaba's poverty and wondering what sort of grain his wife wished to use, she rubbed a little suet on the bottom of the measure. Then she brought it to her sister-in-law with apologies for having made her wait. She had struggled to find it. Alibaba's wife returned home with the measure and counted out the gold. Then, while her husband buried it, She carried the measure back to her sister-in-law. In her haste to return it promptly, however, she failed to see that a gold coin had stuck to the bottom. "Sister-in-law," said Ali Baba's wife, "you see that I did not keep your measure for long. Here it is, with my gratitude." She had hardly turned to leave when Qasim's wife, inspecting the measure, spotted the gold coin and was amazed. Envy gripped her heart. "Ali Baba has gold by the measure," she said. "Where has that wretch found gold?" She burned to tell her husband, who was in his shop and would not be home before the evening. The afternoon ahead seemed to her a century. When at last he returned, she said, "Qasim, you think you are rich, but your brother is infinitely richer. He does not count his gold like you. He measures it." She asked her to explain this riddle, and she told him by what ruse she had discovered the coin in the measure, a coin so ancient that the name of the prince inscribed on it was unknown to her. Far from rejoicing in the good fortune that had lifted his brother out of poverty, Qasim became so jealous he could not sleep. He went to his brother before sunrise, though he no longer called him by that name since marrying the rich woman. "Ali Baba," he said, "you are full of secrets. You claim to be poor, and yet you measure gold." "Brother," said Ali Baba, "I am not sure what you mean." "Enough dissembling," said his brother, showing him the gold coin. "How many more have you got?" It was clear to Ali Baba that through his wife's imprudence, Qasim already knew what he had tried so hard to hide. There was nothing to do but to tell him all, without the slightest mark of sorrow or surprise. He recounted by what twist of fate he had discovered the robber's lair, and offered him a share in exchange for his secrecy. "I expect nothing less," said Qasim proudly. "But tell me exactly where it is, and how I might enter it myself. If you refuse, I will report you to the law, and you will lose it all." Ali Baba, more out of kindness than fear of his brother's threats, told him all the secrets of the cave, including the words needed to enter it and exit. Qasim left at once, hoping to arrive before Ali Baba and get the treasure for himself. Before dawn, he set off with 10 mules bearing empty chests. He found the path, the rock, the tree, and by the door he said, "Open, sesame!" It opened and shut behind him. Greedily, Qasim took in the cave, which was even more packed with treasure than Ali Baba had described. The longer he looked at each thing in turn, the wilder his excitement. He could have feasted his eyes all day on the gold, but remembering that he had come to remove it, he hastened to fill as many bags as he could. His mind was so fixed on his new fortune that when it came time to leave, he found he had forgotten the secret word. Instead of sesame, he said, "Open barley," and the door stayed fast. He named several other kinds of grain, but it would not move. Qasim panicked. The harder he strained for the right word, the farther it slipped from his mind, so that it too seemed to have been locked away where he could not reach it. He threw down his bags and paced around the cave, oblivious now to its riches. The thieves returned around noon. When they saw the mules grazing around the rock with chests on their backs, they charged, scattering them into the forest. The men lost no time running after the mules. It mattered more to find their owner. As some hung back to search around the rock, the captain walked the others to the door, sabers in hand, and opened it with the secret words. From inside the cave, Qasim heard the horses, and he knew his end was near. Still, he resolved to escape, and as the door opened, he flung himself outside and knocked the captain down. But he could not evade the other thieves, who killed him with their sabers on the spot. Inside, they found the bags Qasim had tried to remove. Those Ali Baba had taken went unnoticed. They could not understand how anyone had entered, as the opening in the vault was inaccessible, and only they knew the secret to the door. The thieves corded Qasim's body and nailed it to the wall inside the cave, 2 corridors on each side, as a warning to others. Their work done, and resolving not to return before the corpse's stink had faded, they closed the cave and rode off in search of caravans to loot. And I'll leave you with that cliffhanger. To learn how the story ends, and to read other stories, including in this terrific volume, you can buy or borrow the Annotated Arabian Nights, Tales from 1001 Nights, by visiting the NYPL event page. Thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed the program.